Sequel number 21. Welcome. This is the Church of Uganda at 150, and we are celebrating our church history with the producer Christopher Amos Chikomeko Ntambi. We are now coming to the conclusion of the period that followed the martyrdom, and today we are going to look at the death of Alexander Mackay and later Father Laudel, Simeon Laudel or Mapera. And of course we are going to see the history in between there and the state of the church and what is really happening on the ground. And so let us start. Apollo Kagwa, the new catechumen, was and remained the main military leader of the Anglican Christians. And now he was at somewhere at the top, because remember, during the Civil War, Katikiro Mukasa had died, Katikiro Henry Nyonyintono had been killed, Katikiro Muguluma had died, and even Katikiro Sempagala had also died. All those died during the Civil War. So Apollo Kagwa knew that Kabaka Mwanga, who was even up to that time unbaptized, and seemed to be very close to the Roman Catholic Christian faction, for he had always allied with them. Don't forget the Chiwewa Palace history. Yeah. So it is a long story as far as his closeness to the Roman Catholics was concerned. And if you remember, when he ran away, again it was to the Roman Catholic mission south of Lake Victoria, where he took refuge. Okay, one could say, but then how come he used to put on as a Muslim? That was to disguise himself because he was in exile. So Apollo Kagwa knew that in order for the Anglican Christian faction to really have the balance of power, he had to work hard to strengthen their numbers, but most important, they had to get firearms. Because remember, Karl Peters had armed the Roman Catholic because of the help of Mapera. So Apollo Kagwa had no doubt, and he could clearly foresee that this Kabaka Mwanga and the Roman Catholic military faction could cook up another civil war to get rid of the Anglican faction. So he required himself to get arms. He needed arms, but he didn't know where to get them from. But he had to get friends. He had to make friends. He had to look for arms so that he could prepare. So he was therefore very happy to host the chief of Kochi, Chiefdom Kamuswanga. At that time was called Edward Ndaula Okubiri. He wanted to appreciate him for the provision of his Bakochi army during the civil war that toppled Kabaka Rashid Kalema. He came with many beautiful young women, and Kabaka Mwanga picked one called Nanjala, who he gave to Charles Stokes, the Muzungu who armed the military Christian exiles in Kabula. So Charles Stokes confessed, me, I'm a married man, I have a Nyamwezi woman in Zanzibar. But Mwanga insisted that Nanjala would be given to him, and actually Nanjala got an enclosure within the palace, so whenever Charles Stokes would come, he would find the wife available whenever he came. So Charles Stokes bought the idea, and he had actually wanted payment, because remember they promised him to be paid through ivory tusks. But because Kalema was still in Singo Bunyoro, that area, there is no way they could get access to the elephants, to get those men, to get the carcasses of the elephants, to be able to get the elephant tusks. So they had to ask him to wait, or do other things as they tried to get the ivory tusks. So this woman Nanjala with time bared Charles Stokes a daughter who was called Louisa Stokes, and later a son who was called Kasajja Charles Stokes. Unfortunately, Loisa died while she was still a baby, but the half-caste Kasajja Charles Stokes grew up at the Nkao Palace, so the palace had a Mchotara boy. And after Kamuswanga and Edward Ndawula II had returned home, Apollo Kagwa in November of 1889 invited his eggmate and Ankole military leader, Nuwamba Guta. Remember, he's the one who welcomed them in Kabula, to thank him for the support that Ankole gave through the Omugabe in Tare, the 5th. And the Baganda Christians while in Kabula were able to prepare because of this man's support, both the Omugabe and this military man, Nuwamba Guta. Now, Apollo Kagwa also thanked Ankole for the support, the actual support of soldiers. Because remember, when Muguruma attacked, they were able to defeat him by the help of the Ankole troops. And so Nuwamba Guta brought with him the former roving ambassador of Kabaka Mutesa, Mika Sematimba. And he requested that he be forgiven. Now, I don't want to go into what Sematimba had done, but Sematimba was in exile. When the Christian went to Ankole, they found him there. So it was a long story I don't want to go into. But anyway, Mwanga accepted to forgive Sematimba. And Apollo Kagwa was very delighted, for he would use this expertise. I called him a roving ambassador. He's the first man to ever go to do these things, of diplomatic things between Zanzibar and Ankole and Buganda from Mutesa. So he was very experienced in diplomatic language, in speaking Swahili and all that kind of stuff. He could also speak English, by the way. So Mwanga accepted, and Apollo Kagwa was very happy that now he had a man who he would use to try to find arms, to look for arms, to equip the Anglican military faction in Buganda. Now, the following year, in February 1890, Alexander Mackay was still at Usambiro Mission in Tanganyika, and he got a visitor called David Dix, who found the mission deserted. Alexander Mackay told him that the Usambiro mission was deserted because they were trying to disband it to return to Buganda. As a matter of fact, this is the only area where we have proof that Alexander Mackay had intended to return to Buganda. But the reason he gave to Dix was that this was being done in phases. And that was why the mission seemed abandoned. So David Dix, in his own diary, then describes the way he found Mackay, that Mackay at the time was a gentleman but of a very small stature, that he had a rich brown beard, that he had brown hair, that he wore a white linen all the time and a gray hat most of the time, until he fell ill. Now, it was the normal malaria fever, but the medication had not yet been replenished following the group that had returned to Buganda, having taken what was available. And this Muzungu visitor, Dix, could not leave Mackay alone in that condition to go look for medicine at the shores of Lake Victoria, because he was very new in the area. He didn't know much of that lake area. So he used his own medication, but it did not help. So at 11 p.m. in the night, on the 8th of February, 1890, Alexander Mackay died at the age of only 41. Now, Alexander Mackay was buried at the town I told you earlier about. It's called Musalala Ndogo. There was a cemetery there. And he was buried in a very rich wooden coffin, which he had personally made previously, for that was one of his specialty. Now, a monument consisting of a boiler, which Mackay was building, was set up right next to the tombstone with his name, and the details were inscribed on them. He was right next to the tombstone with his name, to the tombstone of Bishop Henry Parker, the successor of the first Bishop of Eastern Africa, James Huntington. Unlike Mackay, Bishop Parker had been buried in a backcloth without a coffin. but his grave was clearly marked with a headstone. Now, these are important things. We shall be revisiting them in the future, in future sequels. How each were buried and who was buried in a coffin, who was not. They will become very, very important in future sequels. In the same year, 1890, while in Zanzibar, the German Karl Peters, who had come to Buganda and signed an agreement with Mwanga, was claiming that he had signed off the area. Now, of course, the British were shocked, and so they gave the Imperial British East African Company a royal charter in 1888 to administer and develop the area as a British sphere of influence. Now, the head of the IBA, the Imperial British East Africa Company, was someone called William Mackinnon. And so he sent a message to Captain Fredrick Lugard, his staff, who was very far away in Kikuyu, to rush with troops and enter Buganda to try and reverse everything that Karl Peters had done, if at all it was true. So this gentleman, therefore, receives this message in November of 1890, and he left George Wilson Tayari in charge of Fort Dagoretti, and him with De Winton and many other porters and troops composed of Somalis rushed through Kavirondo and into Busoga chiefdom. Now, why didn't the Basoga raise a storm? You see, Mwanga was no longer that powerful. He was the Kabaka, but what could he say? It was more of the Anglicans and the Catholics who were really in power, not him. So there is nothing he could do, even as strangers passed through the east. Now, they entered Buganda, and Lugard ignored all the warnings he got. He was very much armed. He even refused to seek for permission to enter. He simply entered into Buganda. And therefore, when the force arrived in Buganda, the Protestant or the Anglican military faction, as well as the Roman Catholic faction, were put on full alert, but they were told not to attack the invaders because they didn't know that these were either invaders or not. Now, Captain Lugard sent messages ahead of him, who he was, and explained that he had no ill intention, and that all he wanted was to speak to the Kabaka and inform him of what the European forces had decided. Don't forget that Mwanga already knew about all this, as we saw during the martyrdom history. So Lugard entered Buganda. He attempted to march onto the Nkao Palace, but the Buganda Christian forces blocked him on Nkao Hill leading to the palace. Captain Lugard, clearly showing that he had no intention of fighting, told his men to make camp on Nkao Hill as he negotiated his way to the palace. His soldiers camped in a relaxed mood on Nkao Hill before the eyes of the soldiers of the Baganda. Then on the 19th of December 1890, Katikiro Apollo Kagwa and Reverend Herbert Walker from Namirembe Mission were invited, and they were all present when Captain Lugard met Mwanga II, that is in Nkao Palace. Now, Apollo Kagwa was more than delighted that the European visitor was an Anglican, a Christian, and that he had come to undo what the German Karl Peters had done with Mapera. So Apollo Kagwa was not aware of the truth in the Karl Peters Treaty and thought that undoing it meant disarming the Roman Catholic Christian faction. That was his dream. But Captain Lugard told him the truth about what Karl Peters had done and what they had really signed, and they were all shocked. They were all shocked. Now, the negotiations for the Imperial British East African Company to protect Buganda while the natives remained in power impressed Mwanga, because Mwanga had thought they would come and remove him. But they were saying, no, Mwanga will remain in power, but they will be around to protect the kingdom so that nobody else takes it over. Now, the fact that Carl Peters, through agreement, said something else in comparison to what KAPERE had told them greatly embarrassed the Roman Catholic missionaries. And finally, the British Protection Treaty was agreed and signed on the 26th of December 1890. The Kabaka put his handmark on the treaty, as did Katikkiro Apollo Kaggwa, Kyaddondo County Chief Kaggo Paulo Bakunga, Bululi County Chief Stanlas Mugwanya, Captain Fredrick Lugard signed for the Imperial British East African Company. There are two witnesses, the Busiro County Chief Sebwana, the Mugema, Joshua Kate for Buganda Kingdom, and De Winton, the IBEA guy who accompanied Lugard to Nkau. Now, in England, a picture artist who became a priest, the Reverend Alfred Robert Tucker, was consecrated and enthroned the third bishop of Eastern Equatoria. This is what we are going to observe tomorrow, and also be able to know how KAPERE himself met his death. May the good Lord bless us all.